I need to flash the lights out in the lobby, I think. I know one of my faculty is out there running around. So, welcome everyone. I learned this morning when I got up and saw an email from 12:37 maybe this morning um, from Guy that she would like me to come give a welcome for the afternoon session. So my name is Dane Webster, and I am the relatively new director of the School of Art here at Texas Tech. And my remarks will be brief because I'm just doing them off the cuff. But I want to welcome all of you. I know I had a little bit of anxiety at the very beginning of like, is this going to work? Are we going to be able to get people here given the conditions? And it's wonderful to see this size of a group. And I showed up here at about 12:30 and seeing people have conversations over lunch, and that was really exciting. So as I said, my comments will be brief. So a few thank yous maybe to start. And so the first one is whoever provided the coffee out there for lunch, you may have saved a life. So thank you very much for that. I especially want to thank Guy and Guy Fermo and Joe Arredondo for their efforts to pull this together. As I was talking to Guy a little bit ago, she said, well, Joe has been half of my brain for a little while. In Joe's role as the director of Landmark Arts, he is frequently at least a percentage of my brain as the director, helping me navigate troubled waters at times. So a round of applause for both of these two individuals. I really appreciate it. The last thing is I got up this morning and I was just thinking about what to say during a welcome. I was just talking through to my wife about this, and in the conversation I was reminded my previous gig, I was the director of a large animation program at another university, and when I would give tours to the incoming prospective students, I would always say to them, just the nature of our curriculum there was that animation is a team sport. And I would frequently mention the statistic from the movie Deadpool for any of the comic book people out here. The movie Deadpool, 537 visual effects artists worked on that. And then just the other day, we were having a conversation, our recruitment committee, and one of our faculty here from graphic design, we were just talking about, in this era of COVID, how do we bring the fun back into the things that we do? And he said, people need to be reminded that art is a team sport. And I had heard this, I used to say this all the time, obviously, about animation, and it was about the production side of it. But it was also this reminder that so many of the things we do, especially at a university, but within the arts and design, whether it's at that beginning idea development or whether it's through the production or it's the very end when we've produced these things, we have to run back to our community, we have to talk to our team about what it is that we're going to do or what we have done and how we go to that next step. So it's very exciting to see art and painting as a team sport here today in this auditorium. So I think I'm supposed to turn this over to Guy, and she will welcome or start our next presentation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dane. That was beautiful. Keep your mask close. All right. So I'm delighted to open up the afternoon sessions. First, we'll hear from Dr. Kevin Shua, who teaches 18th and 19th century European and Southeast Asian art history at Texas Tech University. Recent publications are the 2 volumes that he co-edited, entitled Uncontainable Natures, Southeast Asian Ecologies and Visual Cultures, for the journal Antennae, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture. He is currently working on a book on vitalism in the art of 18th century French artist Jean-Baptiste Greuze, and another book on Southeast Asian modernism. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Steve. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
So I would be really eager to hear from the contingent from Houston about this talk. and I'm would really be thrilled to talk to Sharon Compriva and Kelly Ellison if they're still around. I guess I would say that this is just one take on this exhibition, an important exhibition of 1985. It's not meant to be like the final word. Right? Where I'm coming from this is, or my connection to it is, maybe there's a history of Southeast Asians living, working in Texas, and I'm originally from Singapore. But there's also, some questions of the global, like what is the global, where is the global, and also questions about what is history that run through this talk. On January, on January 25th, 1985, Fresh Paint, the Houston School, opened at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. The exhibition, featuring 78 works by 42 living painters who had spent a significant amount of time in the city, served as a last hurrah for its curator, Barbara Rose. With an impressive track record of academic publications and exhibitions, she was hired by the museum in 1981 to give its shows and collections a world-class polish. While she continued to divide her time between New York and Houston, she loved the Bayou City. Quote, Houston was a cool place to be, very rich culturally. I mean, there was Zydeco, dances, and ZZ Top, and even though it was a very segregated city, there was an incredible sense of openness. It's not like New York. Houston doesn't want to be New York. And that appealed to me because I didn't want to be New York, unquote. Yet by the summer of 1984, frictions at the museum started to mount. She felt like she had a lot of responsibility, but little power. Her acquisition list for the museum was frequently denied. Those tensions surfaced as Fresh Paint was still in process. It had started out as an exhibition focused on John Alexander and his friends and former students, including Bert Long, Kelly Allison, Chuck Dugan, Sharon Capriva, Ron Hoover, Jeff DeLude, and Jim Pogue, but eventually broadened out to include more artists from the city. Rose was adamant about including Black and Latino artists, given their lack of representation in major exhibitions, and tried to foreground important women painters. She hired local art critic Susie Khalil, on the right, with her deep knowledge of the city's art scene to assist her. Focused yet capacious, the show was intended to speak to a broader audience outside the city, to position Houston nationally, as it were, as well as do something for Houston's community of artists. In an interview with the Houston Post before the opening, Rose tried to fend off the approaching critics. Quote, I think it should be clear that it's called the Houston School, but it's not about any specific style. It is very divergent in terms of styles because I did not start out with an idea. I just looked. She and Khalil were simply going to show the best painters they could find. Quality, she said, is the foremost criterion. Most critics in Houston heap praise on the show. It makes you proud, wrote Patricia Johnson for the Houston Chronicle. Fresh Paint, quote, may not be an elegant or a cohesive exhibit, but it has infused the community with questions, offered some answers, and focused attention on Houston artists as being important on a national level, unquote. Many continued to have mixed feelings over whether there was such a thing as a Houston school, while a handful of artists protested their exclusion. But it was the critics in New York who delivered the harshest verdicts. Reviewing the show in the New York Times, Grace Glueck wrote, quote, while it's true, as Rose notes, that the National Endowment and other funding sources have contributed to the growth of regional art centers, these centers have by no means developed strong individual profiles. The schools with which Rose compares Houston, and she writes as though they were still viable, were concerned with very specific modes. And even she concedes that what she too glibly calls the Houston School is far too pluralistic for such a handle. The truth is that seeing this show without reading its labels, the viewer could easily confuse it with one produced right here at home, in other words, New York. And then, at pleading the case for regional art and Houston as its avatar, she summed up, "This show fails utterly." It's an impossible yardstick, of course. If art from Houston is too similar to that of New York, it's dismissed as an imitation. If it's too different, it's not even registered. By the standard of evaluation, either way, New York wins. In what follows, I'd like to reframe the exhibition in the following way. What seemed at the time like a canon-making exhibition in defense of a regional school of painting can be seen from another angle as an exhibition that reoriented the city away from the east coast of the United States and towards the south, Latin America. With globalization, the accelerated movement of people, goods, and capital around the world on the horizon in 1985, why did so many artists in the show assert the primacy of place? The outsized legacy of New York school painting at the exhibition could be seen in the work of John Alexander and Joe Glasgow. Alexander had moved from Houston to New York in 1979. There he struggled living his painting. The apex of this intense and difficult 1979 to 82 period was his 1982 triptych, "I've Been Living in a Hydrogen Bomb," pictured in the background there. Rose, in her letter to a young artist in an issue of Vanity Fair a year later, praised him as the model of the artist who was promising and not corrupted by the marketplace. His 1982 painting, "My Friend's Revenge," was accessioned by the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and he showed birds in bondage for fresh paint. But even in the 1980s, his painting was something of a throwback, as he churned out painting after painting, built up from piercing observations of the human condition. His compatriots Ross Bleckner, David Saleh, and Julian Schnabel took a different, more ironic path. Joseph Glasgow had worked alongside the abstract expressionists after World War II. Success came quick. In the 1950s and 60s, he was shown and collected by the Met, MoMA, the Whitney, and the Guggenheim, and he was included in the seminal exhibition 15 Americans alongside Pollock, Rothko, and Still. When Catherine Viviano's gallery closed in 1970, he moved to Galveston, where he lived near Michael Tracy and Julian Schnabel. Chosen for fresh paint was a 10-panel folding screen, which had a new technique based on placing staccato brushstrokes on glued strips of torn canvas, creating a deeply textured all-over feel of dark color that crackled with energy and literally lifted off the picture plane. Yet it could be said that Glasgow's work, so assured of its European modernist inheritance, had little to say in 1985. While both his and Alexander's work garnered praise at the exhibition, they seemed like the last holdouts of a bygone era. To me, their work provided evidence in the exhibition of the waning relevance of New York. Some of the older, more senior artists in the exhibition did show well. Foremost was John Biggers, unanimously accepted as the most accomplished Black artist in Houston, who by 1985 had recently retired from Texas Southern University. Born in the cotton mill town of Gastonia in North Carolina in 1924, he enrolled at the Hampton Institute in Virginia in 1941, intending to be a plumber, but met the man who would turn out to be his mentor, the artist and psychologist Victor Lowenfeld. Lowenfeld was an Austrian Jew who had fled Nazi Germany for refuge in the United States. Sharing in Lowenfeld's empathic social vision, Biggers, quote, began to see art not primarily as an individual expression of talent, but as a responsibility to reflect the spirit and style of the Negro people. "It became an awesome responsibility to me," Biggers said, "not a fun thing at all." When Biggers won a prize at the 1950 Museum of Fine Arts Houston Annual Exhibition of Houston Artists, he was not allowed to attend the award ceremony due to a segregation law. Then director of the museum, James Chilman, begged him to accept the award at a separate Thursday night viewing party. Quote, "If you will do this one thing, I guarantee you there will be no segregation at the museum next year," unquote. Chilman desegregated the Museum of Fine Arts the next year, long before the city's libraries, schools, and sports stadiums. Biggers went on to establish and nurture a viable art department at Texas State University, which soon became Texas Southern University. Biggers had long been inspired by the mural tradition of Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco. From them, and this is one global connection, Biggers understood the way murals could cradle the beleaguered self, could lift the soul. In the many murals that he produced, Black men and women would stand firm and proud, rebuking the assimilationist need to hide their culture behind closed shutters. Biggers boldly cast Black experience into the public on a grand scale. A UNESCO-funded fellowship gave him the opportunity to deepen his understanding of his African heritage. He spent 6 months in 1957 traveling through West Africa, researching African history, and documenting the people and their rituals, publishing several of these in the book Ananse, The Web of Life in Africa, 1962. In Ghana, Biggers said that he, quote, found a dignity I had rarely encountered before, for I had been accustomed to living with warped personalities all my life. I admired the African straightforwardness, a characteristic that contrasted sharply with the slippery maneuverings of American culture. In many of these drawings, you can see him channeling Kate Colwitz's woodcuts, the way the barest line could cut through, could clarify a thicket of pain. 2 years after his return to the States, he began work on Jubilee, Ghana Harvest Festival, which opens us out onto the annual New Year's harvest celebration of the Akan people of southern Ghana. And this work was chosen for Fresh Paint. We see a ceremonial dance by which each participant represents a star or planet, moving in a large circle. They sing songs and give of thanks and give praise. The painting beckons us to join in the ceremony. We cannot help but purposefully stride forth with these women. Flowers and moons sprinkle on the women's clothing as they're already in unison with the cosmos. We might think about the fact that in the 1950s and 60s, maybe still in the 1980s, a global identity for Blacks in America was hard to see. Not only were there still the countless soul-crushing images of Black passivity, the fact of the Middle Passage was kept hidden in American culture. It was as though the history of slavery had to be repressed for actual neo-slavery to continue. Biggers' painting daringly shows African Americans possessing a longer, deeper history of rituals and memories that stretch back centuries. One of Biggers' most talented students was Kermit Oliver, hailing from a refugio, a South Texas valley town where Blacks, whites, and Latinos blended easily. Oliver found his stride at TSU in Houston. Even when he was a student, he worked furiously, illustrating 2 books for the University of Texas Press and completing not 1 but 6 murals at TSU's Hannah Hall. After a brief stint teaching at TSU for 3 semesters, he showed his work at the Courtney Gallery and was picked up for a show at the prestigious Dubose Gallery, the first Black artist to show his work at a major gallery in Houston. Yet Oliver would shun fame and fortune, retreating from the art world for a quiet life as a postman in Waco. The work for Fresh Paint was the enigmatic self-portrait, "Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Basra," which originated in the book of Isaiah about a doomed, arrogant city in southwestern Jordan. I can't say for sure whether the painting best represents Oliver. His painting uses allegory to demolish the pieties of official Christianity, with the viewer thrust into a boundless expanse to commune freely with the animals. We are all God's creatures. A space beyond judgment, beyond suffering, awaits our atonement. My work, Oliver said, is a reverberation of memories. Curiously, Oliver's most well-known work may be the 16 scarf designs he did for Hermes, which took 3 decades of work beginning in 1980, selling at $410 a pop, but worth double or triple in the black market. They are coveted by collectors, including T-Boone Pickens' wife, Magdalene, and Chase Bank executive Elaine Agatha. What I find so remarkable about these is not just their command of decoration, I cannot help but think of Kahinde Wali, but the way his imagery haunts us back to a different time. The overused word surreal cannot quite capture the sense of strangeness, the way we seem to be pulled into the universe of Filippo Lippi or Fra Angelico. One important choice for the show was Dorothy Hood. Born in Bryan, Texas, Hood grew up in comfortable middle-class surroundings in Houston. Her parents' divorce when she was 11 led to a dark adolescence spent largely with a depressed and frail mother who had tuberculosis and went blind in one eye. Though Hood studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, her most formative experiences began when she went to Mexico City on a whim in 1941. Mexico City in the 1940s was like Paris in the 1920s, the gathering ground for surrealists who had fled war-torn Europe, dissident muralists like Diego Rivera and Orozco, and a whole host of writers and poets like Pablo Neruda. There were also artists from a younger generation. Remedios Varo and Leonora Carrington brushed shoulders with Rufino Tamayo, Jose Luis Cuevas, and Matthias Goeritz. Even as she kept the nomadic lifestyle, upon marrying the Bolivian composer Jose Maria Velasco, she maintained contacts with dealers and collectors in the United States. But though she has had shows at the Willard Gallery in New York and the Meredith Long Gallery in Houston, Hood never managed to break into the New York art world and has not had the fame of women such as Helen Frankenthaler or Agnes Martin. It was only after she returned to Houston in 1961 that she began painting on a large scale. These works have us adrift in primordial seas or extruded from volcanic explosions. Of course, it was unusual for women to work on such an epic scale. Of her work, she wrote, quote, "Almost everything in life can be imagined as receptacles, vessels, and with reverence, chalices. In plastic art, form is the shadow of an essence that has gone on to meet a new function. Light is the measure and the return of the gift of magnetic fields. Space extends itself over and is the breath of every essence. The eye is our own earthly right of possession of the cosmic orbs. There exist spaces in the mind's eye. If this kind of space meets cosmic space, then it is as though the mind's eye orbits into the realm of stars," unquote. Hood strove to paint what was beyond the visible, where the cosmos slid into the universe of the mind. Rose and Khalil chose centrifugal orbit number 5 for the show. The painting skewers the vertical orientation of the body. Our standing figure is pulled in contrary directions. Perhaps like a NASA spacecraft entering the outer atmosphere, we are released centrifugally into the void. For Hood, the void is not just a black hole of despair, but a space of potentiality. Quote, "It's a space left behind, but also a space of the psyche, a conduit of energy and memory of other realities," Susie Khalil wrote. Fear and insecurity begin the painting. A jagged red and blue line crackles with electric energy, flipping between life-giving pulse and deadly omen. Falling upwards into the void, we walk that knife edge of the sublime. Now, what is global about Hood's work is the way this view of the cosmos has been informed by different world cultures. What is space in a Mayan hieroglyph, a Taoist poem? We still need to find specific connections between her time in Mexico and the epic jumps of scale in her painting, the way her art seems to transcend place, yet be utterly bound by it. Another artist formed by time in Mexico was Lucas Johnson. Born in Hartford, Connecticut, Johnson moved to San Gabriel, a town east of Los Angeles. He dropped out of an undergraduate degree at UCLA, hitchhiking across Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Bouncing around as cowhand and ski instructor, He sold his drawings in bars. His move to Mexico in 1964 began another phase of his life. There, he shared the philosophical concerns of the Nueva Presencia group, which included Jose Luis Cuevas, Arnold Belkin, Francisco Ecaza, Leonel Gongora, Artemio Sepulveda, and others. They proposed neorealism as an alternative to social realism that they felt by 1961 had run its course. Against the destruction and alienation of the Cold War, Nueva Presencia wanted to give birth to a new man and a new world. What made their transnational existentialism so attractive, so dangerous, was the way it could tip so easily into nihilism and despair. Johnson settled back in Houston with his wife, Patricia Kovo, in 1973. For Fresh Paint, Rose and Khalil showed Johnson's apparition. An acrylic on panel, it was the culmination of a series of mystical paintings based on life in the Istmo de Tehuantepec, in other words, the southern half of Mexico. Apart from the Zapotec and the Nahua in the region, the mountainous sierras that divide the Sotavento have been inhabited by several indigenous societies, including the Chimalapas, Mixes, Chontales, and the Juaves. In the 19th century, even as the Isthmus Zapotec nobility cooperated with colonial institutions, they didn't succumb to Spanish culture. In the painting, we see an everyday scene where villagers stroll or arrange themselves. It seems too mundane to be a ritual. A road stretches back to a town in the distance, perhaps a metaphor for civilization. Why does the man with the sombrero hat and red outfit, dead center, seem both ominous yet familiar? Is he the apparition we are seeing? Outside of civilization, how do we tell reality from dream? This much is clear. Johnson's landscapes are deeply psychological. Towers, shelters, dwellings, ducts, tunnels, paths, and caves can quickly metamorphose into originary spaces of the self. Some of Johnson's best work has us disembodied, looking back on ourselves, as though painting from the vantage point of our future death. We look back from the perspicuity of a dream. I don't have a conclusive explanation for Johnson's painting. It sometimes seems more Mexican than Texan. Is this a transnational existentialism that shies away from place? Or does its history lie in the way it grapples with the specificity, the historicity of indigenous ritual? A number of works in the show took the oil industry as their subject. With its blood-red sky, its flare stack burning in the distance, its grand piano, its reeling nude, and Gone with the Wind lovers, Derek Boshier seemed like an old-time prophet of doom. Boshier's painting was placed at the entrance of the exhibition so that the oil execs who walked past had to confront Boshier's sardonic grin. Bert Leon Luna slyly used a technical drawing of the instrumentation for deep oil drilling as the material support for his painting, as though questioning the very notion of infrastructure, and he called what he did industrial archaeology. It is a little like Warhol's Paint by Numbers series. The work purges painting of its need for originality. Or one thinks of Duchamp's early diagrams. Mechanism, oil machinery now whirring in lockstep rhythm, becomes the new condition of painting. In the 1960s and 70s, Houston evolved into the oil technology distribution center for the world's oil industries. By the early 80s, US companies in Houston and Middle Eastern oil fields signed nearly $7 billion in engineering and related contracts. At least 100 Houston companies provided technological support to the arc of oil fields between Malaysia and Indonesia. Houston soon became a global city whose economic base was affected as much by international as by national events. Though OPEC's actions in the 1970s brought an economic boom to Houston, in 1982 to 83, economic activity declined and unemployment rose significantly, hitting 9.7% in 1983 and growing more rapidly than the nation as a whole. The recession resulted in oil companies laying off people to cut costs. The decline in oil prices in the early 1980s also had wider effects, hampering, for instance, Houston's ability to economically diversify. Boucher and Luna's works are thus global by, somewhat paradoxically, attending to the specificity of Houston as a place. The global advance of capital is often accompanied by a perceived evacuation of identity. Here is the writer Benjamin Moser, who grew up in Houston, recounting a 7th grade field trip to the historical ruins of San Antonio, which puts this sometime in the late 1980s. It was an oddly archaeological expedition, a careful sifting of potsherds, history seen as a series of relics. The sign at the Alamo instructing male visitors to remove their hats was the least of the anachronisms. The rest of the sites spoke only of the abandonment of Texas, its unimportance, its distance from the empires that, often unknowingly, ruled over it. The French happened to acquire a little stretch of East Texas when they conquered Louisiana. The Republic itself, despite its embassies and fantastic territorial claims, was really only a few scattered towns. Texas played a minor role in the Confederacy. It became important only because of its association with the United States. But that point was nowhere made. The tour was a colonial performance, an expensive exercise in self-degradation. It showed a peripheral place, longing to be ennobled by a glorious past. It showed no confidence in our present culture, no inkling that that culture was worth investigating, unquote. Moser is speaking of Houstonians, or even Texans, need for a simulacrum of history, a fantastic history that obscures other real histories and cultures that lay right under their noses. Taking aim at Susie Khalil's line in the press release that, quote, because they realize no one is looking over their shoulders, Houston artists are free to explore various themes and styles, doing so with meaningful conviction, vitality, and vision, art forum critic Thomas McEvely charged that this position implied a large-scale rejection of art history. He meant that Houston artists avoided going toe-to-toe with artists of the past. Quote, to place these artists in such a limbo outside of history and awareness does not do them justice, he jabbed. But McEvely was measuring art by a New York-centric art history, and the haughty universalism of his review is jarring. As I've tried to show, many artists in fresh paint had no need for affirmation from New York. They were engaged with art history and history of the world outside the studio. I want to say that this attention to history was not simply the approach of a few artists in the exhibition, but also the product of its curator, Barbara Rose. Here is a passage from her essay in the exhibition catalog. Because of the coexistence of a variety of ethnic, religious, and special interest groups, that experience can be highly contradictory, as can the changing landscape of Houston. At its outskirts, the sprawling city turns rural. In the high-tech heart of downtown, immense glittering mirror-faced towers face each other's like the feudal fortresses of contending medieval princes. So much contradiction and contrast, both cultural and visual, creates a certain surreal atmosphere that is reflected in much Houston art, unquote. The key word here is contradiction, which entails not always sublating them, or these terms, into a higher entity, grappling with contradictions, not reducing nor dissolving them, made Rose belong to a tradition that I call Formalist Realism, a methodology that she learned from her mentor, the famed art historian Maya Shapiro. Shapiro knew how to see contradiction in all its concreteness to not ease away the tensions in the spiraling column of beasts at Suya, for example. Contradiction allows for heterogeneity and allows for multiple times to be gathered in an exhibition or a work of art. Everyone expected her to do a New York-centric show, but Rose didn't provide that. Instead, she gathered diverse trajectories of painting in Houston circa 1985. From the vantage point of 2021, fresh paint seems pressingly global, an early moment in the reorientation of the museum and of the city, perhaps, towards the Americas, as seen in the new Kinder Building installation. Just look in cavernous room after room at the creative juxtapositions, the intelligent hangs, the dredging up of unknown artists from storage. The ground floor room with John Tangley and Jesus Rafael Soto effectively decenters Euro-American art, putting Tangley into conversation with his Latin American counterpart. In another room, John Biggers comes across less like a fawning imitator than as someone whose personal circumstances allowed him to inherit Keitha Kollwitz's mode of art. Turning a corner, we find Dorothy. Here's another shot of the Biggers. Turning another corner, we find Dorothy Hood's stunning Haiti, an intelligent curatorial choice, as it was one of her first large-scale paintings when her work took off. Rotating our axis of orientation from east-west to north-south requires a certain humility. It requires us to see the United States less as an autonomous North America than as part of the Americas, a much bigger continent. Against the city's desperate clamor for history, fresh paint brought the reassurance that Houston already had a rich history and a brimming culture, if we only bothered to look. Thank you. So I'm not going to take questions, but feel free to come, like, talk to me after, during breaks, whatever.
Someone's going to hand me a flash drive, and then we'll introduce our next panel. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Chua, for that incredible paper. It was wonderful. It is time to introduce our next panel, entitled South of the Checkpoint, North of the River, Understanding Painting Along the U.S.-Mexico Border. We have 3 panelists taking part, so I'm just going to read a short bio sketch of each. First is Rigoberto Gonzalez. Born in 1973 in Reynosa, Tamaulipas, Mexico, Rigoberto lives in Edinburgh, Texas. He earned his BFA from the University of Texas at Pan America in 1999 and holds his MFA from the New York Academy of Art, conferred in 2004. He currently teaches drawing and painting at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Gonzalez's work has been exhibited at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., the Konsthallen Bohuslands Museum in Uddevalla, Sweden, the Museum of Contemporary Art branch of the National Museum of Wrocław, Poland, and the Guildhall Art Gallery in London, England. He has participated in artist residencies at the Roswell Artist Residency and the Santa Fe Art Institute Artist Residency Program, both in New Mexico. Our second speaker, M.C. Ferris, was born, or could be Chad, be either. Chad Ferris was born in 1971 in Texas and attended Texas Tech University. He earned a Master of Art Education with certification in spring 2006 and holds its MFA in painting from Texas A&M University Commerce completed in spring 1998. He holds a BFA in studio art from Texas Tech University, conferred in 1995, and attended the prestigious Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 1997 in Skowhegan, Maine. He currently lives and works as an artist and associate professor of art at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley in the borderlands of Texas. Our third speaker, Gina Gwen Palacios, was born in Taft, Texas. She earned an MFA in painting from the Rhode Island School of Design, a post-baccalaureate certificate in studio art at Brandeis University, an MA from the University of Texas at Austin in instructional technology, a BA from Texas A&M University Corpus Christi in TV and film, and an AA from Del Mar College in radio and television. Gina is currently an assistant professor of painting and drawing and the Brownsville coordinator at the University of Texas at Rio Grande Valley. Gina has exhibited in the US and abroad, including the Arlington Art Center in Virginia, Carlsbad Museum in New Mexico, Asia Geisberg Gallery in New York, Villa Victoria Center for the Arts in Boston, Liszt Art Center, Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, Bait 15 in Abu Dhabi, Antiism Gallery in Montreal, and the Newport Art Museum in Newport, Rhode Island. Welcome.
I'll be the first one to present. Let me forward the image here. You might see me without my mask. I apologize. I lost my mask, but I'm vaccinated and I'm ready for a booster. If there's a booster, in an hour, I'll get the booster right away. Uh, the Well, I would like to first of all, I'd like to thank Texas Tech for hosting the symposium. But also, more importantly, I want to thank Guy for putting all this together, organizing it. I think it's a heroic undertaking, organizing something of this size. So I want to definitely thank Guy for putting it all together. So I'm very glad to be here. I'm also very honored to share the panel with my colleagues, with Gina Palacios and Michael Chad Ferris. Uh, the presentation, the title that I have for it slightly different than what Guy presented. The way that I remember writing it, it was north of the border, south of the checkpoint, and it's specifically the checkpoint in Falfurrias. So it's that area. You can see it on the map there. You look way down. We use the cursor, way down here. It's that area, that area of Texas. That we want to, kind of bring some spotlights to. The three of us teach painting at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. All three of us live in that area. The university serves this border area of Texas. Each one of us deals with the life experience of the border very differently. Also, we all paint very differently. Uh, I was born on the border town of Reynosa, Tamaulipas, Mexico. I have to applaud Guy's pronunciation of Tamaulipas. I think you did great also. And it's a state, all those states that border Texas on the Mexican side. I mean, you could be talking about people recognize, parts of the Middle East more easily than these states that are very close to us, like Tamaulipas, Coahuila, Nuevo León. Everybody knows Chihuahua, but those other ones people just largely, forget. So because I'm from that area, I was born on that town. I think my work is more. It reflects more the culture and the social political situation of the area. I spent most of my adult life in South Texas, with the exception of a couple of years in New York City as an art student, and another couple of years living in New Mexico, more specifically in Roswell, while I was there as an artist at the artist residency program. The border or la frontera is an area I'm fascinated with and find rich with subject matter and have decided to make it the focus of my work. From the dramatic events that are occurring along the border, such as this painting here, which is titled "All That Is Beneath the Heavens." The painting depicts the almost insurmountable obstacles immigrants face on their journey. Uh, if you look closely, just to give the landscape a sense of scale, uh, down here at the bottom, you see a group of immigrants that are about to, take the final steps of their journey and, try and attempt to cross the river. But there's other obstacles. You have the border wall. You have observation drones in the sky, monitoring their presence. So this kind of imagery is what inspires me and what I deal with, but also images like this, simple still life objects that we see in our, that I would see growing up, like these packets of tortillas. And even though let's see, my work is very much about this area, I think it has received a good amount of attention, so much that some of it has traveled uh, across the Atlantic, and that's what I wanted to show you here. A situation that I'm, very proud of. The This is the Konsthallen Museum in Sweden, and here we see a painting by one of my favorite artists, the Flemish painter Jacob Jordaens. It's a painting of Mary Magdalene painted in about 1858. It is painted in the style of the Baroque. Uh, it is the style that moved me to become a painter. And so next to it, on the wall, the round tondo, is one of my paintings. Later on, I'll talk about the context of that one particular painting. Baroque painting is, my main influence. Uh, Baroque painting's narrative qualities, its ability to tell a story, are especially important to me. My paintings use the visual vernacular of the Baroque period to address contemporary issues of the border. I felt that the themes were highly dramatic, chaotic, exuberant, dynamic, and with a strong narrative element. All these words that could easily describe Baroque paintings. Among the general characteristics of Baroque art are a sense of movement, energy, and tension. A strong contrast of light and shadow, and has the dramatic events that are that are depicted. Realism is another integral feature of Baroque art. The figures in paintings are not types, but individuals with their own personalities, and that's what I try and capture. The people in the paintings it's people that I know, people that they can easily be that the viewers can identify with. Another thing that is important to me, and it's hard to grasp with a presentation like this, is a sense of scale. All these are life size figures. And moving on to the next image, one of the more recently completed paintings, and well, this it just got picked up by the Smithsonian for the next portrait competition. So I'm really hoping to get those $20,000. I think is the prize. And also like the Tondo that was in Sweden. You know, a lot of people think that the area that we teach and we live is overlooked, they're forgotten. But it's my experience that if you do good quality work, they will come and they will pick it up. And I've had the Smithsonian come up pick up my paintings. I've had when those paintings traveled to Europe, they picked them up and they found out about me. They picked up the work, and so I think it's this idea of being isolated nowadays is not really possible to be isolated because there's so much in social media. Technology has, I think, shortened the distances. Um, but also, I wanted to show this image because it allows me to discuss a couple of social issues that my work deals with. And clearly, immigration and the drug war are what my work mainly grapples with. But I'm going to talk about some of these, some of these issues a little bit in a little bit of context to give context to the painting. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect and has now been renegotiated by the current administration in power. NAFTA had some serious negative effects on the Mexican economy. NAFTA flooded the Mexican market with subsidized American crops, which jeopardized Mexican farms and the country's food self-sufficiency. It drove down the price of crops produced by Mexican farmers. It made it difficult, nearly impossible for them to feed their families. So what motivates a man to risk his life by crossing a river or a desert? Uh, so what motivates a man to pick up a rifle and become a soldier in a cartel's private army? And I think the simple answer is not being able to feed their families. That is the motivation to take up such enterprises. And to some extent, that is what NAFTA produced. And in understanding the recent immigration crisis, we also have to consider United States foreign policy in Central America. We have sent troops there. We've corrupted governments there. And basically, we have supported the elites who protect U.S. Business interests. However, U.S. foreign policy is only one of the many factors that have contributed to the instability of the region. This painting we see here, it's titled, most of my work has two titles, one that reflects a more universal, aspect of it. Like this one, I titled it, The Flight into Egypt. Or if you prefer, its alternate, more modern, title, Refugees Crossing the border wall into South Texas. It depicts a young family descending onto American soil. The sunrise symbolic of brighter days ahead. You see that behind, the head of one of the children. They have arrived and found shelter from the uncertainties of Central America. But at closer inspection, as we look at the ground, we see the debris that America has produced and that America has to offer them. We see the remnants of fast food, of over-sexualized, addictive consumerism. We see newspapers that display the current political instability. We see symbols of white nationalism, of anti-immigration. And if you look closely, there's a mask, just like the one that I just lost right now, to symbolize the plague of biblical proportions. They're even bigger than, if you think about this current plague we had. Like, when the Bible was written, they had a different understanding of the world. So that this is bigger, much bigger than. And also there's there's fast food trash along the bottom there. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a lot of detail that went into not just the figures, but of course around the the details around the figure as well. And this painting also I was mentioning this last night at the talk. I spent a good amount of time visiting before the pandemic the respite centers in McAllen, Texas. Talking to the immigrants and getting their stories, their struggles about their journeys. Now the next images they deal with the drug war, and this is more past work. Mexico has historically been a supplier of drugs to the United States, especially marijuana and heroin. In the 90s, Mexico became the major route for transporting cocaine. This brought huge profits to the drug cartels. Currently, 93% of the cocaine coming into the U.S. comes through the southwest border. Along with the increase in revenues came turf wars between the cartels for control of the lucrative smuggling routes. Ciudad Juarez, just across the border from El Paso, Texas, became the murder capital of the world. Across the river in the state of Tamaulipas, the turf war continues. The painting we see here has also two titles, one that speaks to the universal themes and one that speaks to the particular or the current conflict of northeastern Mexico. It is titled Perseus with the Head of Medusa, and it's also titled Mujer Zeta decapitada por el cartel del Golfo, which means a female member of the Zetas cartel beheaded by the Gulf cartel. It is in part a contemporary reenactment of Benvenuto Cellini's Perseus with the Head of Medusa in Florence, Italy. And it also references the execution from narco-terrorism videos from the state of Tamaulipas. This is one of the paintings that I showed you that was in Sweden. The title to this is Para que aprendan a respetar, which means so that they learn to be respectful. This is a message that was often left or is still left by the decapitated heads, the heads removed from the body with a roll of gray silver duct tape. Duct tape is one of the preferred methods of immobilizing a victim, and decapitation is the preferred method of execution by the cartels. The start of the drug war in Mexico coincided with the invasion of Iraq. The methods of execution and intimidation were largely copied from the acts of militant Islamic terror organizations. And I've just got a couple more images. This was also part of the Smithsonian portrait competition in 2016. I think it was 2016. It is titled La Guía or The Guide. It depicts a scene that plays itself out daily along the border. It shows a couple who are being guided from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso by a teenage girl. The story as is depicted here was told to me by a friend. She confided in me that from the time she was 10 years old until her late teens, she helped her father, who was a coyote, a human smuggler, in smuggling and guiding people from Mexico into the U.S. She said, and in her words, it was what we would do for a living. We would just charge people whatever they could afford to give us. We crossed people from all over the world, Hindus, Chinese, Romanians, Nigerians. The scene is dramatically illuminated in the style of the Baroque masters I tried to emulate. The source of light is not revealed. The viewer is left to interpret the source of light. If you look closely on the banks of the river on the Mexican side, you see the same three figures just as they prepare to make the crossing. I can point them out. I don't know if you can see them there. And that's something I borrowed that element from Renaissance and Baroque artists where they would use continuous narrative, just to show different sequences of a continuous narrative on the same canvas. Behind the human drama, you have the modern Western landscape. There's the mountains behind Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, which have become populated by colonias or shanty towns. These shanty towns or this landscape is a direct result of or consequence of the modern economic theory of globalization. In the mid-60s, Mexico launched a program of low taxes and lax environmental and labor laws to draw foreign companies to build assembly plants, maquiladoras, along the Mexican border. Many foreign companies did invest in Mexico, which created a migration from the interior of Mexico to the border states. It created these sprawling shanty towns that grew with no concern for urban planning. These shanty towns lack many of the basic necessities for people to have a decent life. They lack a functioning sewage system, access to drinking water, and proper nighttime illumination. With the closing of many of these assembly plants, which have moved to China or other countries, these areas along the border that were once prominent job sources now have a population with high unemployment. So in these colonias, these shanty towns, this is where young men are drawn into the drug trade to work as hitmen or smugglers. It is also in these dimly lit shanty towns where the girls go missing. It is where the young girls' bodies are found. It is where the word feminicide was born. This is the also just to give you a sense of scale. You see there's somebody standing there next to the actual painting. This one, this is 10 feet by 20 feet with over 30 figures. Um, let me just conclude my presentation. I'm often asked, in your work, who are the victims? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? The villains are not present in my paintings. You don't really see them. They are only hinted at. The cartel gunmen, the heavily armored soldiers, the family deciding to flee Mexico, the little girl looking at us. Everyone here is a victim. And I wonder who profits from this misery. And my answer is it's the transnational corporations who lobby for free trade, who profit from the low wages paid in the assembly plants in border towns. Military industrial complex who profits from the military aid sent to Mexico to fight the drug cartels. And also the transnational corporations who run the for-profit prisons and detention centers where immigrant families are held. And also the villains are the many corrupt officials inside the Mexican Congress and state governorships. And yeah, that's my presentation.